Bloomberg, heading into the G7 summit, the US and its allies knew they needed to do more to win over global swing nations also courted by China and Russia. The weekend meeting in Japan showed they face a long road ahead. The gathering in Hiroshima, the site of the first atomic bombing in 1945, showcased the horrors of nuclear weapons following threats by Russian leader Vladimir Putin to use them in Ukraine. A surprise visit from its president, Volodymyr Zelensky, gave him a chance to appeal to leaders from emerging economies who were also invited to the summit and have taken a neutral, and at times ambivalent, stance on the war. Yet tangible progress was hard to see for the group of 7 wealthy nations, even though some Western officials said the bloc was heading in the right direction compared with years past. 3 key invited guests, Brazil's Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, India's Narendra Modi and Indonesia's Joko Widodo, who collectively oversee a quarter of the world's population, spoke of the need for peace in general terms without endorsing the G7 view on Ukraine. In a news conference before departing from Hiroshima, Lula criticized President Joe Biden's rhetoric toward Russia, saying it wasn't helping peace efforts. The Brazilian leader insisted that he condemns Russia's occupation of Ukraine, which he said has the right to defend its territory. But he didn't rule out a solution to the war that includes territorial losses by Ukraine, saying neither sides had viable proposals to put an end to the conflict. Ukraine's proposal is capitulation by Russia, which isn't going to accept it. Russia's proposal is capitulation by Ukraine, which isn't going to accept it, he said. Lula said he was caught off guard by Zelensky's appearance in Hiroshima, after some of his aides described the situation as a trap. The 2 leaders didn't meet over the weekend despite a plea from French President Emmanuel Macron, who urged Lula to understand that there is an aggressor and a victim in Ukraine, according to an Élysée official. G7 latest, leaders finished talks focused on Russia and China. Brazil publicly said that Indonesia's President Joko Widodo, popularly known as Jokowi, affirmed that he shared the same position on the Ukraine war as Lula. Indonesia's readout of the Lula meeting didn't mention Ukraine, but Jokowi, who invited Zelensky to participate in the Group of 20 meeting last year, separately met with the Ukraine leader and offered to serve as a bridge of peace. Modi, who is hosting the G20 summit later this year, also met with Zelensky for the first time and conveyed clear support for dialogue and diplomacy to find a way forward. But Foreign Secretary Vinay Kwatra, who spoke to reporters in Hiroshima, didn't clarify whether Modi accepted Zelensky's invitation to visit Ukraine, something India has resisted given Russia is a key supplier of energy and weapons. The interactions showed the difficulty facing G7 countries as they seek to defend Ukraine's territorial integrity against Putin in the face of a vague 12-point ceasefire proposal championed by Chinese President Xi Jinping. Russia's top diplomatic ally China's effort to stop the fighting has found support among so-called Global South nations hit by higher food and fuel costs, adding pressure on the G7 to convince the world that Ukraine is worth defending. A senior UK official saw the G7 effort as a success, saying it wasn't realistic to expect India or Brazil to suddenly start sanctioning Russia or sending weapons to Ukraine. Still, the official said, the summit amounted to a turning point for the G7 to engage the Global South with respect and make a concerted effort to counter Russian and Chinese efforts to exploit anti-imperialist sentiment in middle-ground countries to build an alliance against the West. Read more. Zelensky's surprise G7 stop unnerves critical Brazilian leader. Top Lula aide meets Zelensky as Brazil continues peace efforts. G7 seeks stable China ties while de-risking. Communiqué says Ukraine leader Zelensky to visit Hiroshima in bid to rally aid. A long-term goal remains convincing major emerging economies to help enforce sanctions against Russia, which is complicated as they haven't signed up to the measures. The strategy going into the meeting was to avoid pressuring invited guests to condemn Putin and cut off economic support for Russia, and instead emphasize the need to uphold global rules like "don't invade your neighbor" that have kept the world prosperous for decades, according to a person familiar with the situation. Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, told reporters in Japan that pressure was just the wrong word to describe Biden's interactions with Lula, Modi, and other leaders. Instead, He said the goal was to emphasize the constructive role they can play in supporting the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity, which is sacrosanct in the UN Charter. That point was top of mind for leaders as they sought to counter China's calls to stop the fighting, which would effectively freeze gains for Russian troops. Zelensky rejected that formulation in a meeting last week with Xi's special envoy to Ukraine, and other G7 leaders underscored that any solution that didn't involve a Russian withdrawal was a non-starter. It's not a ceasefire that is needed, it is peace, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau told reporters Sunday. And that peace can only be achieved if Russia decides to stop its ongoing invasion of a sovereign neighbor. While the G7 for years has been perceived to mostly lecture the global south, this year the nations have sought to focus more on tangible and targeted offers to key countries as a top priority. A communiqué after the summit mentioned the need to deliver on pledges to mobilize $600 billion in quality infrastructure for developing nations and $100 billion annually in financing to mitigate the risks of climate change, as well as efforts to reform multilateral development banks and address debt vulnerability. With assistance from Suthi Ranjan Sen, Arne Delfs, Isabel Reynolds, Norman Harsono, Judith Ho, and Alberto Nardelli. Adds comments from Brazil's president in paragraphs 5 to 8. Most read from Bloomberg. Biden says U.S.-China relations set to improve very shortly. Zelensky signals Bakhmut falling. Russian casualties high. Zelensky's surprise G7 stop unnerves critical. Brazilian leader traders brace for volatility with U.S. debt deal still elusive. Copyright 2023 Bloomberg LP. Gotta hear both sides. So goes the journalistic maxim turned sarcastic slogan that once championed objectivity in reporting but is now more often invoked to mock news outlets that platform Nazis, conspiracy theorists, and other individuals spewing dangerous disinformation. You can imagine cynics and true believers alike in the bullpen of Succession's Fox News analog ADN using precisely these words to justify some of that network's most irresponsible choices. So it was pretty delightful to see Bothceticism come back to haunt the funeral of Logan Roy, a man who profited more than perhaps anyone in history from the peddling of false balance. If last week's nerve-fraying election day roller coaster faced the global-scale consequences of the Roy's narcissistic actions, then this week's penultimate episode of the series was about legacy. Was Logan the great man Roman keeps babbling about? Or was he a cancer on his family, business, and adoptive homeland? Thanks to Ewan's impromptu speech and an abortive eulogy from Roman, who proved to be not at all ready for primetime, which created an opening for Kendall to deliver an eloquent, if also terrifying, rebuttal, we really do get to hear both sides. What's exciting about this, aside from the opportunity to see James Cromwell flex in a role where he's been great but somewhat underutilized, is that, as usual, Succession has more in mind than just Logan. Titled Church and State, a triple entendre that refers simultaneously to the separation of institutions that form the foundation of secular society, the media convention of isolating journalists from business decisions to ensure editorial independence, and the fact that literal matters of state are being negotiated in the church where the funeral happens. The episode is really about two polar opposite visions of what it means to live a good life. Ewan's eulogy. It's hard to imagine security being lax enough at the funeral of a Rupert Murdoch type to allow a renegade brother to take the mic. Maybe we can blame Connor, who planned the whole shindig but is nonetheless prevented from delivering his own formally inventive speech, which in Shiv's estimation leaves us open to legal action. Well, sometimes narrative and dramatic considerations outweigh the need for verisimilitude. It was important to hear from someone who understood and even loved Logan but was not in thrall to his cutthroat worldview. What sort of people would stop a brother from speaking for the sake of a share price? Ewan demands, after rebuffing Greg and Shiv's feeble pleas for him to sit down. Only history can judge Logan, he says. I can just give you a couple of instances about him. First, we hear a harrowing anecdote about the family's voyage across the Atlantic during World War II. At 4 and 5.5 years old, the boys were forced to keep quiet and still for 3 nights and 2 days to avoid attracting German U-boats. No wonder Logan grew up to be a fortress of self-possession and mental toughness. The second story reveals a more vulnerable Logan. Sick and miserable, years after the boat trauma, the young Logan took it upon himself to leave boarding school and come home under his own steam. By then, the boys had a baby sister. He always believed that he brought home the polio with him, which took her, Ewan recalls. The aunt and uncle with whom the family lived did nothing to alleviate his guilt, they let it lie with him. I took two ideas from this. Logan must have believed from a young age that he was a bad person, and he must have spent his life trying to achieve feats that would dwarf, maybe, accidentally, the act of killing his little sister. It's fascinating to watch the Roy kids' faces as Ewan recounts these defining moments from his brother's youth. More than angry at their uncle or worried about what he might say next, Kendall, Shiv, and Roman are rapt. Throughout 4 seasons, Logan has been an enigma to viewers as well as his children. He kept us outside, but he kept everyone outside, Shiv says later, in her own brief but emotional eulogy. If we're hearing all this about the patriarch's formative experiences for the first time, it seems likely that they are too. Ewan closes by doing precisely what he said he wasn't going to do, passing judgment on Logan. The speech gets a bit florid here, but it makes sense for Ewan, who has always been a fire and brimstone sort of guy, and for a show that collects Shakespearean resonances with each new episode. Logan, says Ewan, is a man who has, here and there, drawn in the edges of the world, now and then darkened the skies a little. Closed men's hearts. Fed that dark flame in men, that keeps their hearts warm while another grows cold, their grain stashed while another goes hungry, and even has the temerity to tell that hard, funny, yes, but hard, joke about that man in the cold. All told, he was mean. And he fed a mean meagerness in men. None of this is surprising, but the language and Cromwell's delivery hit hard. Also moving is Ewan's ultimate acknowledgement, one that's certainly true to the character we know, that he may well share many of his brother's flaws. The difference is, I try, but sometime he decided not to try anymore, and it was a terrible shame. In Ewan's view, living a good life means at least trying to preach, practice, and ideally also feel compassion for other people. Whatever else Logan achieved, he failed as a human being because he made his fortune doing the opposite. Kendall's eulogy. You're gonna say the other side, Ken encourages Roman as Ewan returns to his seat, his sermon met with predictable silence. But let's face it, Roman was never going to give a competent eulogy. For all his willingness to emulate his amoral father when negotiating business deals, he simply does not have it in him to be a public-facing CEO. Every Succession character is the hero of their own personal tragedy, and this inability to control his own emotions is his. When it becomes clear that Roman will not be recovering from his full-on weepfest anytime soon, Ken, who has evolved from an embarrassing clown to a competent and compelling public speaker, is the natural choice to pinch hit. Improvised on the spot, his eulogy is full of Randian, individualist bluster. Logan, he reminds the mourners, and posterity, was a doer and a builder. He made money, the lifeblood of this wonderful civilization that we have built from the mud. He made a positive difference in the world by quickening the ambition to own and make and trade and profit and build and improve. Great geysers of life he willed, bloody, complicated life. As Ken sees it, it wasn't the specific objectives Logan accomplished or the contents of his soul that made him great, it was that he accomplished so much coupled with the ferocity he exuded. Just as Ewan acknowledges that Logan was shaped by trauma, Ken, who picked the most and meanest fights with his father over the years, acknowledges that Logan was, as he puts it, a brute. But Ken seems to be coming around to brutishness. On election day, he chose Waystar and his personal ambition to be the company's sole CEO over democracy and the safety of his children. Now, Rava is taking the kids out of the city instead of coming to the funeral, and Ken is so livid he's decided to sue for full custody. When poor Jess tries to tactfully give notice, after witnessing ADN's premature projection that Mencken won Wisconsin, he absolutely flips out at her. And after the funeral, as it becomes apparent that Mencken feels no particular obligation to uphold his promise to block the Gojo deal, Ken turns on Roman, UF Kedit, with Jared. It all adds up to Ken finally becoming, or at least convincing himself he's becoming, a true successor to Logan. Every despicable act he's committed in the last 2 episodes is something his dad would have done. It occurred to me that Ewan's polio story would probably make the most profound impression on Ken. Doesn't the accidental death of the baby sister sound a lot like Ken driving that poor waiter into the water and failing to save him from drowning? Logan cleaned up that mess, but never let his son forget about it. They're more alike than, perhaps, Ken ever realized. His flaw, as an heir to an empire, has always been that he's soft. But so was Logan once, and so are we all, before we acquire the armor of adulthood. Now that his father is no longer around to shield him from the consequences of his actions, he's growing up fast. What now? With only the series finale to go, what does this mean for the battle to control Waystar? With the caveat that I am notoriously bad at making predictions, here's what struck me about the machinations church and state shows us before, during, and after the funeral. Roman is done. Between flubbing the eulogy and catastrophically misjudging his relationship with Mencken, he's proven himself utterly incompetent. He's also on the hook for the enormous settlement Jerry is preparing to extract from the company. When he bursts into the street, at the end of the episode, to fight with protesters, it's an act of self-destruction second only to suicide. And then there were 2. We know Ken has finally gone full Logan when he approaches Hugo at the garish $5 million mausoleum. I'm still laughing at Cat Food Ozymandias, and enlists him to undermine the deal in the press. It won't be a collaboration, he warns. You'll be my dog. But the scraps at the table will be millions. Hugo, a shameless sycophant, woof, woof. That media strategy backfired before, in Norway, where Matt's son figured out the CE brothers were behind the so-called leaks. The difference, this time, is that Ken is taking steps to get the board on his side. Don't count Shiv out, either. Devastated as she was, just hours earlier, by Mencken's victory and her family's role in it, she has since hatched a plan to secure his support for the Gojo deal. It's a savvy move to offer a US CEO to a nationalist, and of course that CEO would have to be Siobhan Roy. This puts her in direct competition with Ken. And Matsson's mysterious call to Shiv, claiming he got a yes from Mencken, would seem to put the pro-Gojo camp in an advantageous position going into the finale. At the same time, I am pretty firmly convinced that Succession is not going to let any of the Roy kids walk away happy. I wouldn't be surprised if the one-on-one bonding Matt's son apparently did with the probable president-elect ends with those 2 sketching out a mutually beneficial future for Waystar Gojo that completely sidelines the Roys. On one hand, I am not at all ready for this show to be over. On the other, I can't wait another minute to find out how it ends. Greece's main Conservative Party pulled a major victory in Sunday's election, setting up a second vote in the summer that could give the party an outright majority in the parliament. According to election results, the New Democracy Party, the party of current Greece Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis, had a double-digit lead over its main rival, the left-wing Syriza Party. Even with the large lead, New Democracy's 40% vote share wasn't enough to gain full control of the 300-seat parliament due to the new electoral system of proportional representation. Mitsotakis, a Harvard-educated former banking executive who became prime minister of the country in 2019, will either have to seek a coalition partner from a smaller party or prepare for a second election later this year to form a government in his country. In a statement, Mitsotakis said he plans to follow all constitutional procedures, though maintaining he viewed the current electoral system that created the need for coalition was akin to party horse trading. Without a doubt, the political earthquake that occurred today calls on us all to speed up the process for a definitive government solution so our country can have an experienced hand at its helm as soon as possible, Mitsotakis said in his statement. This was the first election in Greece since its economy ceased being under the strict supervision of international leaders, who had provided financial relief for the country during its nearly decade-long financial crisis. The second election, which is expected to be held in late June or early July, would be conducted with a new electoral law that gives the winning party up to 50 bonus seats in the second round of voting, Politico reported, making it easier for the country to form its government. In a statement, Syriza head Alexis Tsipras called the election results exceptionally negative for his party, adding that they plan to examine the results and how they came about. However, the electoral cycle is not yet over, Tsipras, a former prime minister of Greece, said in a statement. We don't have the luxury of time. We must immediately carry out all the changes that are needed so we can fight the next crucial and final electoral battle with the best terms possible. The Associated Press contributed to this report. For the latest news, weather, sports, and streaming video, head to The Hill.